TikTok, for instance, really exposed me to the fact that there was another generation coming up that was actually
Right.
really hungry for deep theological content, and they weren't wanting surface answers.
So I will admit that the last video I released was a bit somber, not exactly upbeat. It was a little dense, covered a lot of material. So I wanted to make sure that we had something a little bit lighter. So my interview with the Reverend Brandon Robertson came up. Initially, I was only going to release it in the springtime, but it's a really good interview. Brandan is a ordained minister in the UCC, the United Church of Christ, and he's a LGBTQIA plus activist, specializing in the intersection between spirituality and sexuality. He has a number of books out, but the most important thing is that he's a wonderful person. And I got to know him a little bit on this podcast interview. I really hope that I can interview him again and kind of dig down into some of the subjects that he's passionate about and that I certainly would just like to know more about from his perspective. So I certainly hope you enjoy this podcast. I'm Jon DeHoyos. Peace, love, and tortillas. Brandan, thank you very much for coming on the show, for coming on the podcast. If you could start with a little bit of your background, because it's one of the things I always love to find out is how did you get to this point that you are today?
Yeah, that's a great question. And like so many of our stories, it's complicated and convoluted, but
Mhm.
um, kind of the big meta narrative is I didn't grow up in a religious home, but
Mm,
around the age of 12, I started going to church with my fundamentalist Baptist neighbors.
mm,
And I had a pretty rough upbringing. And so I was struggling with lots of mental health issues, suicidal ideation, all of that at a young age. And when I went to church with them for the first time and heard a message about a God who loved me, cared for me, could redeem my broken life and make
mm,
something out of it, that really resonated with my young soul. And I had kind of the typical walk down the aisle, pray the sinner's prayer conversion experience, but it truly did change my life. And within a few months of regularly attending church after I got saved, um, I felt a distinct call to give my life to preaching this same message that I had heard at this church that had transformed my life. Um, Fast forward many years, I end up going to Moody Bible Institute to get a degree in pastoral ministry, thinking I'm going to be an evangelical pastor. And while in Chicago, I really had my own deconstruction experience
mm,
because Moody's right in the heart of downtown Chicago. And whenever we walked out of the campus, our theology was confronted with reality,
mm.
and the kind of narrow view of the world that I had adopted and was being taught in school wasn't holding up when I went to the Roman Catholic Church Holy Name Cathedral down the street from us and sat in mass and experienced what I understood to be the Holy Spirit. And
Yeah.
yet our theology said the Holy Spirit isn't in the Catholic Church. And in Chicago, there's this great street called Devon Street, which is largely Muslim. And during the call to prayer times, you'll hear it blasted on the street, and people will get out of their cars and kneel down and pray. And I remember I was there with a Moody student, a friend of mine, and when he heard the call to prayer, his response was, "This is demonic. This is evil.
Mm.
We've got to pray against it." And what I experienced was, this is beautiful. These are people trying to connect with God in a way that's different than ours, but seems just as legitimate.
Yeah.
So that kind of stuff kept happening. And at the same time, I began wrestling with my own sexual identity. And it was studying the Bible and having conversations that really began to open my eyes to the fact that there were different ways to be Christian, that this kind of narrow theology we had been given was not it. It's not the only way to be a Christian in the world. And um,
Do you
a
ever
really
get
long story. Yeah, go ahead.
do you ever get pushback on that? About the idea of there's only, either one way or a pluralistic way of looking at it.
Totally. I got pushback while I was at Moody. During that time, I had like a blog and a podcast, and I was interviewing people that at the time were considered heretics to our camp of Christianity. And I got called into the dean's office 6 times over 4
Mhm.
years, not because I was doing drugs or sneaking out and having sex or any of those fun things that people do in college. It was because I was talking and writing about Brian McLaren or N.T. Wright, people that were
Mhm.
not that far out there, but
Right.
had a different way of articulating the faith than we did. And it was the fear that I experienced
Yeah.
primarily from my evangelical world that really opened my eyes because the scripture is so clear. God is love and love casts out fear. If we're responding with fear, it seems to suggest that we're not actually aligned with the God who expels fear. So maybe
Right.
our way isn't the right way. And that opened Pandora's box for me and led me on this crazy journey.
Yeah. Well, so I was listening to, it was on your Instagram feed, and there was an interview, and I completely forget the gentleman's name that you were talking to, but you had mentioned how at a certain point you had talked about because you got the book coming out, Queer and Christian, and the idea that you're just like, I'm past this. I don't want to necessarily box myself into I'm the queer pastor.
Yeah.
That is not your whole identity. At the same time, it's, maybe it's an outsized because of who you are and how you identify and who really needs calling, or I'm sorry, who you're calling to.
Yeah.
How do you balance that of, like, always trying to make sure that those people feel pastored, that you're giving pastoral care to, but at the same time expanding your own spirituality?
Yeah. I mean, this is a big thing for me, right? So, I mean, after Moody, I ended up kind of getting involved in this gay Christian movement,
Mhm.
and really did have an opportunity there to kind of be formed and to reconcile my own faith and sexuality, and then got the chance to start, as you said, pastoring people first online through blogging and podcasting at that time, and then I got called to a church in San Diego that was largely LGBT, and so it did become a big part of my
Right.
life and still is. But the thing is, I've spent probably a better part of 10 years kind of having the conversation about, does the Bible condemn homosexuality?
Right.
And for me personally, those questions are settled. I've moved on. But you're exactly right that TikTok, for instance, really exposed me to the fact that there was another generation coming up that was actually
Right.
really hungry for deep theological content, and they weren't wanting surface answers. They wanted to engage deeply. And that has kept me in this work of
Mm.
I've had the opportunity to get educated at 3 theological institutions. I'm doing a PhD in Bible, right now, and so much of the knowledge that exists out there that has existed for 50 years just isn't accessible to the
Right.
average layperson.
Yeah.
And so I really do feel like that is my calling to take what I've been privileged to learn and share it with as many people in an accessible way as possible. And that is largely the LGBT community. Um, and I feel honored to get a chance to be in those conversations. And as you said, I also want to be clear that, like, my pastoral ministry, like, I pastor a church here in New York, rarely focuses on the topic of LGBT inclusion. And there are so
Mm.
many
Right.
other issues and things that I would love to give my time to address. So it's always that balancing act of I have this unique platform and sense of calling towards this community and this message, and I wanna be speaking more than that because I do think our
Sure.
faith has more to teach us than just reconciling our faith and sexuality.
Right. Oh, it's interesting. There's something you had mentioned earlier, about, the expansiveness of your knowledge, and so as to where that comes from, a friend of mine, and I'm rambling a little bit because I'm trying to gather my
Yeah.
thoughts, but a friend of mine, I've known for, over 10 years now. He was in seminary. He was at St. Thomas Seminary here in Connecticut, and, by the time he graduated and was, literally they were getting him a ticket to go to Rome uh to get, was it sanctioned, or whatever the ceremony is,
Sure.
he realized he was atheist. And,
Mm.
he goes, "It actually happens pretty often in seminary where people kind of like, eh." And, so when I started to get to know him, and with my background, I was at the point where I always say that I spent about after I left my former denomination, I spent about 12 years in the wilderness,
Mm,
and just did nothing spiritually. And what I experienced, which I thought was very surprising because I had rejected so much of my former religion, that I Isaiah had talked about the fire in your bones,
mm,
and that whenever the Bible would come up organically in conversation, I'd want to talk about it.
mm.
And I realized I'm like, no, this is something that I want to talk about. So I talked to my friend, and even with that, he goes, you know, I know all the philosophers. I know, St. Augustine, and I know this guy, and I know, John Locke, and um, I don't really know the scriptures that well. And,
No,
so and I find that a lot of times where your base of knowledge can be so, a mile deep but an inch wide,
yeah,
and trying to figure out for yourself where your theology lies, and especially in the UCC, it's because we have a lot of autonomy, we can really develop that. And, how did what was your process in this of trying to figure out what your theology was?
yeah. I mean, you're absolutely right that, and this is the common deconstruction experience, whether it's
Right.
in an academic institution or not, that when you start pulling the bricks out of the wall of, we'll call it Orthodox Christianity, the whole thing crumbles pretty quickly because
Mhm.
for me it was, oh, we misinterpreted some of these verses about sexuality. The context about these 6 verses is
Right.
very different than our modern context. Well, wait, does that mean that there are other places that we've
Mhm.
misinterpreted? Does this mean that the Bible isn't without error? And the whole thing begins to crumble.
Right.
And a lot of people do end up, rightfully so, going towards the atheist direction. And I've spent time flirting with atheism.
Right.
For me, I wouldn't say I have a comprehensive theology, and I'm at a place in my faith currently where it doesn't feel very important to have answers to all of the big questions. I
Mhm.
am a theological nerd. I get the sense that you're in that space too. Like,
Yeah.
I love talking about this stuff. I'll spend
Right.
hours talking. But at the end of the day, does it change my life how I articulate God and what attributes I give to God, or um, whether the Bible is inspired or inerrant or whatever. Like
Mhm.
those questions are interesting, but they're not actually all that impactful to our day to day life. So my theology really today sits with, I do believe that there is a God. I've experienced that God, and I do believe that Jesus reveals the face of God to us in a way that I think is profoundly subversive and challenging to our modern world. And beyond that, everything else is up for debate. Everything else is worth questioning. Um, and it's a lot less stable. My world is a lot
Mhm.
less grounded as it was when I was a conservative and had all the answers. But there's also a liberation and freedom. I'm not afraid to explore and to ask questions because I don't think that the God that does exist is going to give us a theology test at the end of our life and
Right.
send us to hell if we get it wrong. And so, yeah, I mean, week by week, my theology will sound different. And it does, like in the pulpit at my church. But that's because my job as a pastor is not to teach you God's truth, it's to raise questions, to give you
Mhm.
information, and to allow us to wrestle with it together.
That's awesome. And kinda getting back to, where that long email outline that I had sent you, I and at the time that we were kind of going back and forth trying to align schedules, I was in the middle of writing, a sermon, on Romans 1,
Yeah.
and, at the end of the day, I'm looking at this and it was, I don't know, 12 pages long, this sermon, and I was getting into the Greek translations and all these different things, and I kinda sat back and I was like, I at the end of the day, am I really gonna convince anybody who's entrenched in their thought? And then I thought about what Paul said, I think it was to Timothy. where he goes, "Stop arguing over words. This is
Mm,
because it's just gonna lead to ruin for the one who listens." And I thought, "Okay, I can see that." But at the same time, well, how do you try to reach somebody's heart? And I was like, "Well, there's gotta be something a higher something higher that you can call to." And that's when I kind of one of my favorite scriptures is Micah 6:8. What is God asking back from you but to, act justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with your God? I'm like, that to me was a much more universal, way of testing.
yeah,
And, so it's just like, whatever if your understanding of a certain passage, which, especially when you get into the letters, it's like, well, you're reading somebody else's mail. And
yeah,
so, um, but once you really get into that and you have a particular understanding of an issue from a scripture, well, then you need to test it even one step further and say, does my understanding produce the right kind of fruit? And is it in line with love, justice, and mercy? If it's not, then you got to question it. As
yeah,
you had mentioned.
totally. No, I love that. I think that's a helpful frame, and it is very hard for people to actually get there because so many Christians, I would say a majority of Christians, have been given a version of our faith that is rooted in theological correctness rather
Hmm.
than the fruits of the Spirit. And that's a big paradigm shift. I mean, it
Right.
was for me, it is for all of us who deconstruct, but to actually believe that we are finite human beings talking about an infinite God, that of course we're never going to be able to articulate precisely
Right.
the truths about these things. That's why humans have been asking the same questions for thousands of years. But so when you're able to give up that need to have the answers and actually focus on being with people, loving people, that is where our theology actually is formed. And even for the conservatives who believe that they have a paradigm they need to believe in, their theology is shaped by the people around them.
Hmm.
And that's what I tell people on the LGBT debate. Like, I think it's important for queer people to understand the affirming case.
Right.
And if they want to change their non affirming parents or friends or pastor's mind, don't sit down and debate with them because you're right. This is just going to be an endless back and forth.
Right.
Um, but live out your life as a
Mhm.
queer follower of Jesus and allow them to see God in you. And that relationship and that witness and experience, that is what changes people's minds. And I think that kind of says it all back to your point. It's
Yeah.
the lived experience.
And while you're at that, do you try and kind of go back and forth depending on the person? As to whether you're pulling on the technicalities or you're pulling on the fruit of the understanding. What, you know, is it an amalgamation of these things, or is it you really try to focus on one thing?
Yeah, I mean, like, I'll give an example. I recently, at the church that I'm currently pastoring, there was one person in our congregation who was really hung up on this issue and was like, I'm not sure I can support you as our pastor because I don't
Mhm.
know what the Bible says. And I spent a better part of a year going through, walking text by text with this person, probably 20 something hours of conversations. And at the end of the year, this person ended up saying, I'm still not convinced
Mm.
and I can't be a part of this community. That to me was just kind of evidence of this idea that it's like there are some good reasons to debate. And I debate people a lot because I
Mhm.
think like if people are putting out information into the world that I think is inaccurate or unhelpful, I want to offer a
Or
different
harmful.
perspective. Yeah. But at the end of the day, even in debates that I do, the one thing I always try to do is show up as a Christ like person, especially in a lot of the conservative debates where the people are not Christ like back.
Right.
Because to your point, my hope is whether or not people are convinced by my argument, people will see the fruit of the Spirit. They'll see, hopefully, my own gentleness and at least be opened a little bit more to thinking,
Right.
well, maybe I didn't agree with Brandon, but there's something going on in
Right.
him that seems like Jesus, hopefully. And so, again, to that point, it's just like sometimes you will convince people, but it's gonna be very rarely that you're gonna have 6 verses and hash that out with somebody. What's gonna change people's minds is when they see that queer people or whatever issue or kind of
Mhm.
person we're talking about isn't the stereotype that they have in their head, isn't the demonized, scary thing that they have in their head, but is a real embodied person seeking to follow Jesus in the same way they are.
Now let me ask you, in this process, do you ever find yourself kind of, that inner voice that is, from what you were taught in seminary, or it was it seminary or just college?
Yeah, seminary.
Okay. So in seminary, that you're still find yourself arguing with those thoughts that you were taught?
Yeah, I mean, there was a period where that was real, and I think that is part of kind of the faith development process is, after you kind of deconstruct, of course, I still have nostalgia and a desire at certain times throughout the year. I'll go back and listen to, God forbid, John Piper sermons or something like that. Like, because here's the thing, it's very easy for us to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but there's a lot of great things that have come from conservative Christianity as well. And I do like to go back and entertain those ideas. But the one thing I don't do anymore, and I think there's a good biblical paradigm for this, the word Satan in the Bible literally means the accuser.
Mhm.
And so if you have that voice of accusation in your head that's like, you're wrong, you're backsliding, you're just doing this because you want to be accepted by people, like those voices will come up. And I do think the Bible gives us that very powerful image of that's not a voice from God. If you're feeling accused or afraid,
Mm.
that's not coming from the God who casts out all fear. And I've really internalized that God is love and love casts out all fear. And I don't really find myself struggling anymore with the experience of being afraid of being wrong or anything like
Mhm.
that. But I also am not unwilling to go back and take another look and say, well, maybe
Mhm.
I could be wrong on this. And
Right.
let's see what the conservatives have to say or whoever has to say. And I think
Yeah.
that's helpful.
Well, I get some good illustrations from from the
Yeah,
from the,
totally.
evangelicals. They have a way of captivating their audience, which I
Yeah.
find useful sometimes.
We
Um,
have a lot to learn from them.
yeah,
Yeah,
it's
for sure.
true, and the humility of being like, I could be wrong,
Yeah.
um, but I'm gonna try anyway.
Yeah. Totally.
One of the things that, you know, obviously, I say obviously, I grew up in a very, very religious household. We went to services 3 times a week. We preached on Saturday. And we prepared for the, midweek meeting, or the midweek services the day before. So it was this constant, biblical knowledge or biblical study. And what I found is, the real driver, of religion in my family was my mother.
Mhm.
And what I understood not until years later, after I had left the faith, that she needed that. She
Mhm.
needed the security. She needed the certainty. And, when I left, I remember this conversation that I had with her. And she passed, about 10 years ago or so. But she goes, well, what is the truth? And, and I just left, and
Yeah.
this demand, well, what if this isn't the truth, then what is? Like a
Yeah.
challenge. I'm like, I have no idea.
Yeah.
I have no clue. Um, but, you do whatever your conscience tells you.
Yeah.
Um, but this is what my conscience is telling me.
Yeah.
And but also, to that point is that some people do need that certainty. They do need that rock solid answer, yes, no, black, white. Um, and as much as it hurts sometimes because of what
Mm.
is produced from that viewpoint, I also have to kind of think, well, maybe they're in a position where they can't get
Yeah.
past that. And as hurtful as it is sometimes to myself or other people, I don't know. I guess that's more of a question. Is that okay? Is that something
Yeah.
where you can get past that? of being like, this is what this person needs.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I often say, like, atheists often will say things like, religion is just a psychological crutch for
Mhm.
people that can't handle the world. And I say, yes, of course. And that is precisely why I am religious. Because I do. Like, my favorite author is Albert Camus, who's this French existentialist. I flirt with these ideas and, like, really resonate with the universe is meaningless and life has no
Mhm.
meaning, and, like, there's something there that I find attractive, and when I put that lens on and try to live my life through it, for me, life becomes unmanageable, unbearable, very
Mhm.
hard, and so I do find myself coming back to that my core conviction that there has to be a God, there
Right.
has to be a
Right.
meaning, there has to be a purpose, and I think as progressive or more liberal people, it's really important that we keep perspective. That yes, we can have robust debates. And yes, where theology is actively harming people, let's have robust debates. But your mom believing that Jesus literally died on a cross for her sins to appease the wrath of God and rose again on the third day and is coming again, that doesn't hurt anyone.
Mhm.
That's very helpful and core to her or
Sure.
and to millions of people around the world. And so there's no reason to intentionally try to tear apart someone's foundation.
Right.
You can present different opinions, but, like, our goal should not be to try to convert everyone to our perspective. It should be to learn how to relate to people wherever they're at and to help them in that stage of faith or in that version of faith just become a little bit more loving, a little bit more Christ-like,
Right.
and, disagree on all the other things, but, like, let people have the psychological crutch, so to speak,
Mhm.
because it's a hard world out here, and
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
is helpful to have a faith that can ground you and guide you.
Yeah. To that On that line of thought, um, how do you deal with social media? Well, I mean, I've been on your comment section, and it can be rough sometimes. And I look at these other, I'm going to be interviewing Liz Maul, the
Sure.
deconstructionist, deconstructing the myth, I think is her channel. And I mean, the vitriol that comes when you get on any form of social media, it's just grinding. How do you
Mhm.
deal with that?
Yeah. So on my best days, I remember that the reason people respond that way is out of fear.
Mhm.
I'm on the internet saying that some core tenet of their worldview that gives them security is wrong.
Right.
Of course, they're going to be upset. Of course, they're going to think I'm the enemy. Of course, because I did that when I was a young
Right.
kid. I was the kid in high school telling my gay friends they were going to hell unless they repented. Not because I was mean or wanted to hurt their feelings, but because I believed it and really cared about preserving and protecting the truth that I thought I had. And so, if you can have that kind of empathy when you engage with people, then I actually think you can have some really constructive experiences. I've had people who started off as real haters on TikTok
Mm,
message me a year and a half later and say, "Thank you for being gracious. I've
mhm,
actually come along." On my worst days, though, because I'm a human and I get annoyed and some people are just really rude, you know, I fall into the snarkiness or the biting back, and I don't think that's ultimately helpful. I think it's cathartic and feels good in the moment, but, if we're in this work in any public way, I think it is really important for us to try to be rooted in empathy and
mhm,
recognize that the people that are against us are not dumb. They're not doing it because they're inherently hateful, most of them.
right,
They're doing it because they believe they have truth, and their system necessitates that they protect that truth,
right,
and that's gonna cause them to react in this way. And so, how do we break through that? And I think, again, it all comes back to letting them see Christ in us, being empathic, and watching their walls come down that might actually allow them to evolve and have a different perspective.
uh with the subject of empathy in particular, um, and I'd heard this one. I think it was an NPR article about, um, how that people who may be more on the conservative leaning understanding that it's not that they lack empathy, it's actually that it's a hyper focused empathy. It's like
Mhm.
their community is what they're hyper focused on, that their community, their tribe, whatever you wanna, whatever, word you wanna use, like, that is where their empathy is and extremely deep. And so
Yeah.
protecting that circle is of their utmost importance. Would you agree with that or
Yeah, and I think we progressives have a lot to learn or remember from the more conservative people. One of my mentors was this guy named Ken Wilber. He's a philosopher, and he always talks about transcending and including. As we move along and change our worldview and change our beliefs, far too many of us just transcend and then get this self righteous arrogance of, I'm no longer like that. I've evolved. I found
Mhm.
more truth. That's not helpful.
Right, right.
What's actually helpful is including, retaining the good things from
Right,
the previous place that we've been and telling them that those things are areas of agreement. And I think there's a lot of value for like a progressive Christian community to be focused on systems and structures and refining the country and the world and doing big justice. That's important. There's also a deep importance of actually building community, going deep with the people that are around you, being rooted in your neighborhood, having empathy for the people that sit in the pew next to you. And I think it's about how do we balance those two things? Because if you're hyper focused on your community, you're going to not have empathy and probably demonize lots of other people.
right.
But if you're focused on everybody but the people around you, then I think we see this in our cultural and political moment. People are like, the Democratic Party has left behind the American people because we're focused on big things
Mhm.
rather than the individual needs of
Right,
individual communities. And I think we need both.
right, right. This is where, I'm gonna slightly switch the subject, not too much.
Sure.
So, this project that I'm working on with the VR project, um, so I've been asked to lead this project up, by my pastor here at the, Bloomfield Congregational, and, so I am not a reverend, I'm a lay pastor. Yes, I've had a lot of experience with the Bible, and I know my Bible fairly well, but I don't have the degree to back it up. And I mean, I'm comfortable with it, but I guess I'm getting to the question of what advice do you have for for not just for myself, but also for anybody else who has that calling,
Yeah.
especially one that comes. Not to say I never had it, but um, I haven't really acted on it until I'm 43 years old. So
Sure. Yeah.
So what advice would you give? And this is gonna go on a little bit longer because I also wanna ask you about the site itself, but just to somebody who feels the calling and has an
Mm.
opportunity, what
Yeah.
would what kind of advice would you give?
Yeah. I don't think a degree is
Mm,
necessary. And my own sense of calling, like the reason, and I feel weird about this because I do talk about my own academic credentials a lot only because
people want it.
my sense, yeah, and my sense of calling is more towards education, less towards pastoral ministry. And there's not a lot of queer Christians out in the world that
Mhm,
actually have had the privilege to do the work that I've gotten to do. So that's like, I feel like I'm more of a theological educator, and that's why I'm doing what I'm doing. But to the person who feels called to ministry, whether it's in the context of a church, online, however that might be, go for it. Like
right,
we live in an era where anyone can have a platform, and I don't mean that in an ego sense. I mean that in a ability to influence and impact people for good. And we also live in an era where there's a panoply of resources available
mhm,
to every single person to
right,
get as educated as you want or to go as deep as you want on any topic for free on the internet. And I think that's the imperative is like use the wealth of resources that we have in this moment
right,
and figure out where your unique calling and community is and lean into it. And the biggest thing is Eugene Peterson, evangelical writer, had this great phrase of a long faithfulness in the same direction.
Mm,
I see so many people, and I've done this a lot, who start off in some sort of ministry, be it online or somewhere else, and don't realize that it takes a lot of time
mm,
to really build anything.
right.
I've been doing this work for 13 years to like have any sense of community on the internet. And so it's just a sense of you're called to this, stay faithful, keep walking the same direction, be consistent, be persistent, and watch as
Right.
God works through you to actually impact more and more people in whatever context you're in.
In the context of a online church, which is what this project is gonna be, well, it's actually it's a metaverse, space, so it's a 3D, you put the goggles on and you can immerse yourself in the environment.
Yeah,
Um, and it may seem very to some people, it may seem gimmicky, um, but at least the UCC, when it sent out the grant, uh it's like, "Look, this is a possibility. This may go somewhere. It may not, but
yeah,
we're gonna try it anyway." And I applaud them for that, in that they were willing to take the risk. And
sure.
then, and then we found, we were the one of the, churches that responded to that, and then we went through, being, they interviewed all of us and said, "Okay, well, we're gonna give you the grant." Um, and then, the pastor, here at my church taps me on the on the shoulder and says, "Why don't you take this?" Um, and so, uh, the question that I have is, because this is so different from other things, it's entirely online. One of the biggest hurdles that I think we're wrestling with right now is community. How do you
Mm,
build community online? Or if there's obviously you have a church that you're the pastor for, um but you also reach out, and you are, on broadcast, and you're traveling to different places. How do you retain that community, even, beyond that physical church where you see people every Sunday?
yeah. I mean, I think the pandemic proved to us that online community is possible
Mhm.
and real, intimate, deep community is possible. Not all of us are wired for it. And in fact, I would say probably all of us or most of us should have a physical community that we're connected to, even as we are connected to an online community. And I don't necessarily mean you need a church that you go to and then a VR church that you go to. The
Right, right,
VR church can be your church, but you also need to have real people in your life. And I do think that's the danger we see psychologically today of there are people who are chronically online and disconnect from real
right,
interpersonal community. That's just not good to your psychological health.
right.
But it's very possible to create interactive, deeply meaningful communities on the internet. And it's just about being intentional to not, especially for churches. The evangelical model is we're going to create a really good live broadcast that feels like you're watching a television show. And that
Mhm.
has a place. But if you're trying to build community, that's not it.
Right.
It's really structuring whatever sort of online experience that you have to be relational, to allow people to interact. Um, I had my own online church that we were looking at getting UCC sponsored during the pandemic for 3 years. And it was about not me sitting on Zoom going through the rhythms of a church service, but actually like creating opportunities outside of the 1 hour that we had on Sunday for us to get together, for us to talk about not just Bible, but to talk about life, and creating also fun, unique events that people can do online where it was like, we're just going to get happy hour, have a happy hour, bring whatever you want to drink, and let's just like hang out for a while.
Yeah.
So it's that balance of
Right.
a platform to educate and empower, but also really crafting experiences for people to get to know one another. And I still meet with a group on my Patreon once a month. We've been going for like 6 years now, and it's such a lovely time. I feel like I have a really good
Mm.
community of friends there, even though I've never met most of them.
Right.
So it's definitely possible.
Well, that's good to know. Obviously, so we've w the where the project is at this moment. We're gonna be doing a soft release, in the spring of 2025 and a big public release in the summer. Um,
Awesome.
we're we are, realizing all the technical issues that come with a space like this. Right, like, if you were to get onto the site right now, we could hold about maybe 10 or 12 people. We're
Sure.
hoping to get that up to about 100. So, it's all bytes and circuit boards at this point.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I think we really discovered, during the pandemic is the idea that singing does not come across well on on Zoom
Yeah.
or in online. And so trying to rethink and restructure and repurpose, we can't just take the structure, either order of service or anything, and just plop it onto online, and vice versa. We can't expect our church members to do this in addition to. It's like, no, this is church, and then this is more outreach.
Yeah.
Um, but it's just it's a process, and you're gonna and we're finding we're like, well, we're gonna make some mistakes here, and we're gonna have some bumps along the way in trying to figure out what actually works and what doesn't. But having
Yeah.
the patience and giving ourselves a little bit of slack for, we're figuring these things out. But if you had
Yeah.
to go ahead.
I just would say to you and to anyone else, like, Convergence is this great group you might already be connected with. I got
Mm,
to do some work with them over the last year, and they really are thinking through these questions as well. Like, Jim Keat at Riverside Church, he's their digital minister, and, like, really, people are wrestling with the question of what does ritual look like online? Singing doesn't
mhm,
really work, and nobody just wants to necessarily watch somebody sing. Um, and so all this to say that, like, people are innovating in this
yeah.
space, and obviously you are too. And so there is good work out there. Convergence is probably, I would say,
Mm.
probably at the forefront of building digital spaces. So check it
Well,
out.
I will definitely check them out, yeah. Um, if you had to, and again, a little pivot here, but if you had to define exactly who it was you were trying to reach with your ministry, who would it be?
Yeah. I mean, I do think it's actually very helpful to have a clear focus, a clear target, a clear audience in anything that you do, whether it's writing or doing church or creating content online. On one hand, I would say I'm really interested in bringing back into faith, not that sounds very evangelical, but there's a whole community of disaffected people that have
Mhm,
left Christianity because it's a bad version of Christianity. It's
right.
a version that felt like they had to lie to themselves to believe in. So I want to model for some folks that there is a different way to play with faith and to engage a religion that might be meaningful to you. And that's gay people, straight people, old and young, like that community is vast. But I also do sense in my own life, like I have a unique calling. I live a very gay life. The communities that I'm surrounded by, the friends that I have, like in
Yeah,
my real day-to-day life, is very much the LGBT community, and I feel a deep passion to help these folks feel like they can reclaim faith for themselves
right.
because there's not a lot that exists in the world. There's been good work over the past 20 years to create queer inclusive spaces, but there's just not a lot. And so to be able to speak to that community, that's always front of mind.
Mhm.
And that's also why a lot of my content, like some conservatives just find it outrageous, but it's like, I'm not speaking to you. Like I'm
Right,
speaking
right,
to a community that needs to know they can reclaim the Bible through a
right.
queer lens. And that's going to sound weird to a straight, white, cisgender person, but
Yeah.
like, yeah. So you got to know who you're talking to.
Yeah, and the funny thing is, because you kinda touched on this where it's like, okay, well, part of my identity, tells me that, I need to reach out to people like myself. Um, and as I've been going through this process, realizing that the people that I really am hoping to reach are the people that had very similar experiences to myself, where, I went through that very, very painful process of leaving the religion. That was a 2-year process in and of itself. then finally, when I finally severed ties, I was shunned, so
Mm,
it was I had lost my entire social network, and I had to start that from scratch.
yeah,
Um, you know, so providing like, I didn't really have a support system beyond my former faith, and so
yeah,
it was scary, it was alone, it just somehow or another, I pulled myself up by my bootstraps and went on, but it was hard, and I wish
yeah,
I had something, under me.
yeah,
And
totally.
and I see more and more people from my former religion leaving. I see, ex-evangelicals, ex-fundamentalists, other, people, they've just become nons.
Yeah,
They're now non-religious but spiritual, and trying to provide them something, a soft landing,
yeah,
is something, that's what I really feel called to. Um, and realizing that, you know what, it you don't have to cast as wide of a net as you think, but you're still doing a service, and you're still,
yeah,
living up to your calling. And,
totally.
eh, do you ever question that? Do you ever like, "Oh, I should be doing something else. I should be casting wider, or not casting, specific enough?"
Yeah, I mean, I think 2 things. 1, the best part about doing this online work is exactly that. So many of the people that are in the worlds that we're trying to minister to aren't comfortable and will not be comfortable going back into a church environment. And so to
Right,
have a digital space to go to is appealing to a lot of people. It's easy to try out a digital
right,
space.
right.
Um, but really, I mean, I think in my own personal work, the only time I feel like I question what I'm doing and who I'm reaching is when I find myself spending more time in the argument and in the debate.
Mm,
There's something really fun and compelling about, like, screwing with your old system and the people you used to
right,
admire and, like, spending all that energy. But it's not a good energy. It doesn't feel good in the body.
right,
It takes
right,
a lot out of it. And so it's really I think in all ministry, like, the question is, are we reacting? Are we being negative? Or are we building something? Are we inspiring
right.
people? And, um, I feel like anybody who finds themselves in this space, if you find yourself more on the reacting and provoking, that's not gonna be a long-term strategy. You're gonna burn yourself out. You're gonna
Right.
get lots of hate. Lean more towards the inspired people, and I actually think you'll attract and draw more people into whatever you're trying to do. So
Yeah, it's interesting because and I know I keep talking about my former denomination like it's an
yeah,
ex-girlfriend, but there's a very active community of, ex, members, mostly on YouTube, and, a friend of mine who we had both left the religion separately, and, didn't really even meet each other until after we were out. And we were talking one day, and he goes, these guys that are on YouTube, they call themselves activists, and which, that's fine, but it's all consuming, and they're just focused on the religion and the denomination and the teachings and so forth. And because they are studying the material harder now that they're out of the denomination than they did when they were in.
yeah,
And they've never really healed from what they experienced. They're just reliving it over and over and over again. Yes, they have that freedom to argue it and to criticize it, but what good is it doing than just, nitpicking?
yeah,
Um, and to try and get past that, like I said, I talk about my former denomination like it's an ex-girlfriend. Um, it's a hard thing to do. It's a hard thing to really get over that hump of, like, I need to build something new.
yeah, yeah.
Um, Go ahead.
It No, it's just so relatable, and, that is a necessary stage in anybody's deconstruction
Right.
or faith evolution journey. But you're right, there are people, and I sometimes would fall into this category, who it's like arrested development. You're like you're
Mhm.
stuck in the space of critique, and we just know, like, the way you change the world, there is a time for tearing down and a time for building up.
Right.
And it's got to evolve into reconstruction. It's got to evolve into you finding a new way of seeing and being in the world. That's what the point of any
Mhm.
religion or spiritual path is supposed to be. And so I just think it's a self-awareness thing, and
Mhm.
people need to do the inner work to heal. A lot of people don't do that. They don't even know that they need to actually heal. They don't realize they've been traumatized. Um, and yes, there's a time to call people out. There's a time to pull the system down. That's important.
Right.
But make sure you're spending equal amount of time building something that works for you, offering something that works for other people, because that's the life-giving energy. The
Mhm.
tear down energy will burn you out. It
Right.
will lead you to a dead end. Um, and so it's just not good for our health or spiritual journey.
Yeah. Yeah. So we're coming up on an hour in a little bit. I wanna make sure I talk to you about your book, and, anything else you wanna plug for the future and for any, future listeners.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. I mean, thank you for bringing up the book earlier as well. It comes out in May. It's called Queer and Christian: Reclaiming the Bible, Our Faith, and Our Place at the Table. And really, I've been saying it's kind of like my final word. I'm probably not going to write a lot more about this topic, but it's very different than anything else I've written about the topic, or I would argue any other books that exist on the topic, in that I'm not doing what I used to do, which was just trying to justify myself as a gay person
Right.
to the conservative religious world. This book, I tried to say, I don't believe any of that stuff. I don't believe the Bible's inerrant. I'm admitting all of that. Now, what do we do as
Right.
progressive people, as queer people? Where do you go from here? And I tried to construct a faith that is life giving primarily for LGBT people. But I also think it's a helpful tool for straight folks as well, because it's about being grateful for the lens that you've been given and how you experience the world and can read the text and engage with our faith. And also believing that God is queer, meaning God is beyond boundaries,
Right.
binaries, words. And so helping people to explore, what does that mean? If we really believe that about God, what are the possibilities? What does it mean for how we think about sex, relationships, how we think about spirituality and church? Um, and so I go all over the place in this book, and
Yeah.
I want it to provoke conversation rather than be a answer book to help people better debate against
Right.
conservatives or something.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and it's funny because as I'm going through and making, recording sermons or writing sermons, and I'll have this novel idea, and I'll be like, "Oh, this is interesting." And I'll jump on ChatGPT and be like, "Has anybody ever had this particular," and sure enough, either it's somebody 30 years ago or 1,000 years ago came up with the idea, but at the same time, these it's almost like a boiling pot. You just have to continuously
Right.
roll things and apply them in new ways. So, yeah, I'm very excited to get the book and dig in, because, you know, I just wanna learn. I just wanna learn,
Yeah.
and I
Yeah.
think if we have that attitude, we'll be alright.
Yeah. I mean, that's the one verse I find myself quoting all the time still. Study to show yourself approved unto God. Paul
Mm,
says that. I think that is a good thing for all of us, conservative, liberal, wherever you fall. Be
yeah,
open to learning, be open to being curious, be open to other perspectives.
right, right. Brandon, this has been a great conversation, and I have to say, I'd love to do it again at some point.
I can't wait. It'll be great. Thanks for
Alright.
having me.
Thank you.